Most people don't know that there was a time period when the Jews ruled the land of Israel that we know of as Israel, even before the Romans came to power and after the fall of Jerusalem. That we know that under Nehemiah and under Ezra, that the people came back into the land, but that there was a brief period of time where the Jews, where they ruled over the land. Now we call that empire the Hasmonean Empire. And there were a lot of things that were happening in there that actually we see later on in the Gospels. For example, on Palm Sunday, why did they use palm branches? I mean, what was the significance of the palm branch? Well, the palm branch was the sign of the Hasmoneans. It was actually the symbol, just like the bald eagle is of America, that the palm branch was the symbol of the Hasmoneans. And so we noted last time we were together that there were a series of battles in which the Jews came up against the Syrian oppressors, specifically beginning under the rule of Antiochus Epiphanes. And so then from that, there were a group of people who raised up. We call them the Maccabees. They came after their leader, Judas Maccabeus, the hammer, and they essentially brought freedom and political freedom for the nation of Israel. And so we ended up with a compromise that was made that the Assyrians would get rid of the very pro Hellenistic high priest, and they would put in somebody who was a moderate by the name of Alcimus, and in doing so, that the people would stop rebelling. And so most of the people took that deal. And so, of course, Alcimus was not a good person. He killed many who were non-Hellenists who could have raised up against him. And so Judas Maccabeus went back, got a group of people together, about 800 warriors, if you will, and went up to battle against 10,000 Syrians. And as you may imagine, he lost. And in that battle, he lost his life. Next, on Digging Deeper, I want to take a look at what happened to those who followed after Judas. That's next on Digging Deeper. After Judas died, there was a need for a new leader of the Maccabean cause. And so up steps Jonathan. Now, after the battle in which Judas died, Simon, Jonathan, and Johanan, who were brothers of Judas, with several hundred Maccabean soldiers, fled across the Jordan. From the standpoint of the Syrians, of course, they were outlaws. But to many of the Jews, however, even those who had made peace with Alcimus, they were actually true patriots. And so Jonathan became the leader of the band, and young Jews were constantly being attracted to attached to their ranks. The Syrians tried to wipe them out time and time again, but they couldn't do it. And then finally, they came to Jonathan by diplomacy rather than by war. That's how victory finally came to Jonathan by diplomacy rather than by war. A pretender to the Syrian throne named Alexander Balas arose, and he claimed the throne of Demetrius II. And both parties wanted help from the Jews, because remember, the Jews had a lot of influence in the region. Even though they didn't have a lot of power, they still had a lot of influence. And so they turned to Jonathan as the best man to raise and to lead a Jewish army bypassing the Hellenistic Jews. Now, Jonathan had no interest in either the pretender or in Demetrius, who had tried to kill him several times. So he played a delaying action, which proved successful. And he ended up supporting Balas, and he made treaties with Sparta and Rome. Now, before the war was over, Jonathan was high priest, and he was governor of Judea, and he was a member of the Syrian nobility. So Jonathan's brother, Simon, became governor of the Philistine coastal area that we know of today as the Gaza Strip. Now, since both Rome and Judah didn't like Syria, an alliance seemed to be a good idea. And so the Roman Senate declared itself the friend of Judah. But nothing was done to implement this declaration. So Jonathan's foreign policy brought about a ton of internal prosperity for Judah. The Gaza Strip, which was controlled by Simon, it was practically annexed. And then now we know that Jonathan was killed by a Syrian general, and his brother Simon naturally succeeded him as the ruling high priest. Now Simon, when he assumed the office from his brother, was an old man, and Syria was again torn between two factions: Demetrius II and Antiochus VI, who was just a boy under the control of Tryphon. Now, this Tryphon ended up deposing Antiochus and reigned in his place. We find this in 1 Maccabees chapter 13. Now, Tryphon was the first Syrian king who was not from the Seleucid line. And Simon ignored Tryphon and recognized Demetrius as the rightful king. And then Demetrius, in turn, granted the Jews full immunity from taxes. And this was interpreted by the Jews as an acknowledgement of independence. And so Simon was also able to starve the Syrian occupiers in the fortress of Acre. And he took control of the cities of Joppa and Bethsura. During the peace that the Jews experienced, the question of the legitimacy of the Maccabean priests was finally settled. The Hasidic party recognized the line of Onias as the legitimate heirs to the Aaronic priesthood. Now, the family of Onias fled to Egypt when hostilities arose between the Maccabees and the Seleucids, and any claim that they may have had to the priesthood was therefore forfeited. Now, in recognition of his wise rule, the leaders in Israel named Simon leader and high priest forever, until there should arise a faithful prophet. We find that again in 1 Maccabees chapter 14, verses 25 to 49. Now, this act legitimized a new dynasty, which is known in history as the Hasmoneans. Now, Simon was the last of the sons of Mattathias, and under him, however, the concept of a hereditary high priesthood in the Hasmonean family was legitimized. And in 134 BC, Simon and two of his sons were murdered by an ambitious son-in-law. But a third son, John Hyrcanus, managed to escape, and he succeeded his father as the hereditary head of the Jewish state. Now, under John, we found the growth of the Hasmonean dynasty. This was not the high point of their dynasty and the beginning of their decay as well. So the first three leaders of the Hasmonean dynasty adopted a policy of territorial expansion. The first one was John Hyrcanus. The Hasmonean dynasty began in 135, and with the rise of John Hyrcanus, the generation which has fought for religious liberty was dying out. The new generation was proud of the Maccabean victories, and they were hopeful of even greater successes at home and abroad. But the Syrians grudgingly accepted this new kingdom to their south. They made a deal with John. They would leave him alone if he would consider himself under the greater Syrian empire. Now, what this meant in reality was that John would come to ally himself with the Syrians if they ever needed help in battle. Think of this as a Warsaw Pact or as a NATO treaty. He was also asked to give up the coastal cities which had been annexed by his father and Jonathan, and he was permitted to keep Jaffa, which served as the port of Judah. But the Syrian king then left Palestine, and the Hellenizing party disappeared from the Jewish political scene for a short time. Now, this change in political alignments is an important factor in the reign of Hyrcanus. Previously, the lines were pretty firmly set. The Hasidim represented the conservative elements who wished to retain their religious liberty, and they resisted Hellenism. But then you had the Hellenizers on the other side, and they were willing to sacrifice their religious heritage in order to achieve the real or imaginary gains included in the concept of the Greek way of life. Now, the Maccabean struggle resulted in victory for the Hasidim. Although the Hasidim did not completely align with the Maccabees, they were willing to stop short of political independence in their dealings with the Syrians. So the Hellenists were kept out of the government, and so they morphed and they became loyal citizens, and they ultimately ended up becoming the Sadducees that we find in the New Testament. They kept their quote-unquote Greek way of thinking, but they did so under the rule of the Jews. The Sadducees and the Pharisees were the first mentioned during the reign of Hyrcanus. Before his death, he turned away from the Pharisees and he joined the Sadducees. And from that point on, the Sadducees were associated with the Jewish aristocracy, and they were even at the time of Jesus. This is the background for the New Testament narrative. Now, Hyrcanus took control of both the main trade routes that ran through the land, and it was not unusual that he controlled the coastal road, but controlling the King's Highway on the east side of the Jordan River gave him immense influence, and it helped him to expand his kingdom. Because these were the two toll roads, only two ways to get from the Fertile Crescent down into Egypt. Now, the expansion of the kingdom was heralded by the aristocracy and by the Sadducees, and he forced those that he conquered to conform to Judaism. Now, it's ironic that the son of Mattathias would force religious conformity on people conquered by Jewish arms. The rich got richer, and the average person did not prosper during this expansion. Now, we all know that wars are expensive, in both material and in men. And as you may imagine, there arose an opposition party. Now, Hyrcanus died in 104 BC. Although many Jews frequently differed with his policies, his personal life was free from suspicion. His devout Hasidic background bore fruit in a life which could not offend the most meticulous scribe. So he was a very godly man. His children, however, had grown up in a palace, and they numbered themselves among the aristocrats. Their training was more in Greek than in Hebrew thought, and they looked at the Pharisees with disdain. And so when John Hyrcanus died, the children began to fight. And his eldest son, who preferred his Greek name Aristobulus to his Hebrew name Judah, emerged as the final victor. And he was a tyrant. He threw three of his brothers into jail, where two were thought to have starved to death, and another brother was murdered in the palace. And he continued the policy of expansion began by his father, and in his short reign, he pushed his borders to the north to the territory around Mount Lebanon, and started calling himself king. He ruled for only 1 year, and there was very little mourning when he died. But when he died, his wife released his brother from prison and then married him. Now, his brother was Alexander Janus. Now, he was the only surviving brother of Aristobulus. And so Alexander Janus, he continued to expand the kingdom, but he also continued in the tyrannical rule that began with his brother. Now, Janus extended his borders along the Philistine coast, and he moved closer and closer to Egypt and in the Transjordan area. And it was a little bit bigger than the glory days under David and Solomon. So he really seriously expanded the country. And then they tried to become a maritime power under Janus, and he built many ships. And he continued the practice to Judaize the people that he had annexed. In fact, he added the Idumeans, that would be Edom, and Galilee. Galilee became one of the principal centers of Judaism. But the Samaritans resisted, and they kept their own ways. And that's why when Jesus comes on the scene, you have Galilee up in the north, you've got Judah, Bethlehem, Jerusalem, and so on down in the south, and you have this area in the center, the Assyrian area, where the people that were brought in under the Assyrians, and they fought him. And that's why you would have these two Jewish areas in the land. That took place for the most part under Janus. Now, it was this time that the antipathy between the Sadducees and the Pharisees really became heated. In fact, during the days of Alexander Janus, the Pharisees were kept under control by the use of foreign mercenaries. An open rebellion broke out on the Feast of Tabernacles when Janus was officiating at the temple as the king priest. Now, showing his contempt for the Pharisees, he poured out a water libation at his feet instead of on the altar, as prescribed by the Pharisees. The people of the temple were enraged, and they began throwing fruit at him. Janus called on the soldiers to restore order, and hundreds of people were killed. The result was civil war. The Pharisees called on the king of Syria to help, which was kind of ironic. They helped, and so the king of the Syrians came in and they helped them out, and Janus fled to the hills. The Pharisees were afraid that the Syrians would then annex Israel, and so they decided that Janus and the Sadducees had suffered enough and that they had learned their lesson. And they let them they let them out. So Janus and the Sadducees returned to Jerusalem, and the king rounded up the Pharisees and caught the leaders. He then had a party and he crucified 800 Pharisees in the presence of the celebrating guests. Now, as you may imagine, compromise between the Sadducees and the Pharisees was absolutely, completely impossible at this time. Tradition suggests that Janus repented on his deathbed, and it relates how he instructed his wife, Salome Alexandra, to dismiss his Sadducean advisors and reign with the aid of the Pharisees. And he reigned for 27 years. Now, when he died, his wife, Alexandra, came to power. Now, Alexandra was married to both of the kings before her. And she was nearly 70 years old when she ascended to the throne, and she reigned for 9 years. Now, she was not qualified to hold the office of high priest, and so she gave that honor to her son, Hyrcanus II. And her other son, Aristobulus II, became the leader of the military. Now, at this time, the Pharisees were able to bring back education in Hebrew to the young boys. And there had been way too much Greek thinking going on in their minds. So teaching young boys by rabbis was done in the synagogues. And Alexandra's reign was peaceful, but it did not heal any of the old wounds, and it did not address many of the problems in the land. And so those problems became worse when she died. And again, we have strife in this succession. The Sadducees supported Aristobulus to succeed his mother, and the Pharisees, of course, supported Hyrcanus. Hyrcanus was chosen by his mom, and the Pharisees took revenge on the Sadducees, and much blood was spilled. Hyrcanus, however, was not a warrior, and in a very short time his brother took the throne, backed by the Sadducees, and the two brothers vowed eternal friendship. Aristobulus's eldest son, Alexander, then married Hyrcanus' only daughter, Alexandra, and peace lasted until the honeymoon was over, and Hyrcanus decided that he would live longer if he left the country. Now, this is the short version, if you will, of the Hasmonean dynasty. And we see that there's a lot of intrigue. There's a lot of fighting going back and forth. And one of the things that we find here is that we find the rise of the priest king. Now, we know that none of the rulers of the Hasmonean dynasty was actually qualified by God to be the king. They were Levites, and of course we saw that with Saul, that the only one who was actually qualified to be king in Israel would be somebody from the line of Judah. And so we have this entire setup here in a way that's really destined for failure. And so because of that, because of their willingness to short circuit or to get around what the Bible has to say, there were all kinds of problems because they really didn't have anything solid to stand on. So if you're not standing on the scripture, you really have nothing solid to go on. And so from that, you see this downward decline similar to what we saw in the book of Judges. And so just like in the book of Judges, the last thing that you find in there is you have a judge who comes to power by the name of Samson, who is absolutely, completely disgusting. And but he was the best they had. And he did do some good things, but he was not a godly man. And so the same thing is true with the Hasmoneans. Because they were a people group who did not specifically, um, um, they weren't going to allow themselves to be curtailed by such little things as the biblical record. From that, you see this downward spiral until you finally end up with a king, an absolute despot by the name of Herod, who called himself Herod the Great. And that's what I want to talk about next when we gather together. But for right now, I just want us to see what happens. And again, the lesson that we learn from the Hasmoneans is what happens when you get outside of the biblical narrative. Because I think that that's something that's important for us, that God has given us, if you're a believer, if you're a Christian, if you're a part of the kingdom of God, He has given us a record. He has told us what He wants us to do. And when we get outside of God's plan for us, we end up having troubles. And that's what's happened in the church over the last, I'm going to say 50 to 75 years, is the church has gone further and further away from the biblical narrative and the standards that God has given us. And we end up in the mess that we find ourselves today, and to ultimately where you have evangelicals who are all in favor of murdering children and so on. So it's a problem. And so I would pray that we would learn our lessons from the Hasmoneans. And so I thank you for making it to the end. I know history, I find it fascinating. Not everybody does. But I hope that you can see that as we put a foundation together for what happens when Jesus comes on the scene, that you can appreciate the fact that nothing happens in a vacuum. And there really is a reason for all of the things that we find in the New Testament. So again, I pray that you have a wonderful time with your siblings in Christ as you worship the Lord this week. And I look forward to seeing you again in a future video. God bless you all.